They never raised their voice. They never made a scene. They didn't leave in anger, didn't send the message you were bracing for, didn't confront you with everything they'd noticed. They just went quiet. And somehow, that quiet was the most frightening thing that had ever happened in the room. Most people assume empaths are soft targets. They feel everything deeply. They absorb the emotions of the people around them. They bend toward others with a kind of helpless generosity that looks, from the outside, like something close to weakness. This is the assumption, and it is wrong in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. The quietest empaths are not the most vulnerable people in any relationship. They are the most dangerous. And the mechanism that makes them dangerous is not what you would expect. It is not suppressed anger. It is not hidden resentment. It is not some eventual explosion waiting behind the calm surface. It is accuracy. The empath who has gone quiet has not retreated from the situation. They have completed their analysis of it. They have done something that most people in that room cannot do. They have seen through what is being performed to what is actually happening. And once they have seen it clearly, they stop pretending they haven't. That is where the danger begins. Not in what they say, in what they stop doing. To understand why this happens, why the empath's silence is the most psychologically likely consequential response they can produce, you need to understand something about how the empathic nervous system actually works under extended stress. Because the popular version of this story is almost entirely wrong. The popular version says that empaths feel too much, carry too much, and eventually break under the weight of other people's emotional reality. It treats the empath as essentially passive, a receiver of signal, overwhelmed by input, helpless in the face of emotional noise. The documented reality is more complex and significantly more threatening to anyone who has been benefiting from the empathy of a very quiet person. High trait empathy, the measurable psychological characteristic that researchers identify in individuals with elevated sensitivity to social and emotional cues, is not a passive state. It is an active cognitive and neurological process. The brain structures involved in empathic processing, including the anterior insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the mirror neuron systems in the premotor cortex, are not simply receiving emotion like a satellite dish receiving signal. They are running continuous, sophisticated modeling of the intentions, internal states, and behavioral patterns of the people in the environment. This matters, because what it means is that the empath is not simply feeling, they are reading, constantly, automatically, at a level of resolution that most people cannot access and most people do not know is happening. The person who seems to be absorbing your mood, who finishes your sentences, who somehow already knows when something is wrong before you've said anything, that person is running a real-time analysis of your microexpressions, your vocal patterns, your behavioral deviations from your own baseline, and your emotional congruence. Are you saying what you're actually feeling? Are your words aligned with your body? Are you consistent with who you've shown yourself to be? Or is there a gap between the performance and what's underneath? Most people never notice this is happening. The empath seems warm, attentive, easy to be around. What they actually are is extraordinarily well informed. And here is where the first dangerous thing occurs. The empath, for a long time, does not use this information against you. They use it to understand you. They use it to calibrate how much care you need, to anticipate your fears, to navigate around your sensitivities, to hold space for the version of yourself that you haven't shown anyone else. They do this not because they are calculating. They do it because the emotional logic of high empathy produces a genuine orientation toward repair, toward connection, toward the maintenance of the relationship's health. But there is a threshold. Behavioral research on chronic emotional overextension consistently documents a pattern that emerges when empathic individuals are exposed to prolonged misalignment between what they perceive and what they are told to perceive. When the analysis is telling them one thing and the relationship is telling them another. When they can read that someone is lying, but the lie is sustained. When they can see that they are being used, but the performance of connection continues. When they know, with the precision of someone who has been running this analysis for months or years, that something is deeply wrong, and no one in that dynamic is willing to name it. At that threshold, something shifts, and it does not shift the way most people expect. It does not produce an explosion. It produces a recalibration. The anterior cingulate cortex, which is active both in the processing of physical pain and in the experience of social rejection, begins to function differently under chronic conditions of emotional asymmetry. The system that was oriented toward repair begins to orient toward protection, not protection through aggression, protection through withdrawal of investment. The empath does not become cold. They become careful. And careful, in someone with that level of perceptual resolution, looks like this. They stop volunteering information. They stop filling the silences. They stop explaining, justifying, or translating their own emotional experience form poems other pers will find acceptable. They stop doing the emotional labor that, until that moment, they had been providing automatically and invisibly. And the relationship begins to collapse, not because the empath did anything, because they stopped doing something. And what they stopped doing was the thing that was holding the entire structure together. This is the mechanism that most people never understand until they are standing inside the collapse. The relationships that empaths carry do not feel like they are being carried. They feel natural. They feel reciprocal. They feel like the kind of easy connection that just happens between certain people. What is actually happening is that one person in the relationship is performing a continuous, invisible maintenance function, monitoring the emotional temperature, managing the subtext, preventing the conflicts that would erupt if nothing were done, translating between what is said and what is meant, absorbing the emotional overflow so that the interaction can continue at a functional level. When that function stops, everything it was preventing becomes visible at once. This is the first layer of why the quiet empath is the most dangerous person in the room. Not because they threaten, just because they stop maintaining. And what is revealed when they do is the actual structure of what existed, not the version that was being managed into tolerable shape. Just. Most people find this moment profoundly destabilizing. They don't understand why everything suddenly feels different. They don't recognize that the stability they were experiencing was produced by someone else's labor. They only know that something that felt solid is now fragile, and the person who seemed most emotionally available has become, without warning, completely unreachable. The texts become shorter. The energy changes. The explanations stop arriving. And the empath, who was once the most generous presence in the room, is now a locked door, and no one can find the handle. But there is a second layer, and this one is harder to name. The quiet empath does not simply stop maintaining. They stop participating in the fiction. Every extended relationship contains a set of shared narratives about who each person is, what the relationship means, what is and is not happening inside it. These narratives are maintained through constant small acts of social cooperation. We don't say certain things. We accept certain framings. We allow certain myths about ourselves and each other to stand unchallenged because challenging them would cost more than tolerating them. The empath, up until the recalibration, has been the most cooperative participant in these shared fictions. not because they are deceived by them. They are not deceived. The perceptual accuracy that makes them such precise readers of others also makes them exceptionally clear-eyed about the structures they are operating inside. They have, in many cases, understood the fiction from the beginning. They participated in it because the relationship had value worth protecting, because the person was worth the effort of care, because the honest version of events seemed more destructive than the managed version. When they stop, they do not announce what they have understood. They do not confront. They do not produce a list of observations. They simply stop maintaining the fiction. And the fiction, without the empath's invisible cooperation, can no longer sustain itself. What this looks like from the other side is strange and disorienting in a way that most people find impossible to articulate. The empath hasn't done anything, and yet everything has changed. There is no argument to respond to. There is no accusation to defend against. There is just the quiet. And inside the quiet, all the things that were being managed are suddenly present and unmanaged, and the other person is left with them. This is why people who have been on the receiving end of an empath's withdrawal often describe it as more disturbing than any confrontation would have been. A confrontation gives you something to push against, a position to defend. The empath's silence gives you nothing to push against. It simply reflects back everything that was already there. And here is the third layer. This is the one almost no one discusses. The quiet empath does not only withdraw, they observe. After the recalibration, the perceptual system does not shut down. It continues operating at the same resolution. The empath still reads every micro-expression. They still track the behavioral patterns, the inconsistencies, the gaps between performance and reality. But now they are reading from a different position. They are no longer reading in order to manage. They are reading in order to understand what they are actually dealing with. This is the moment when the empath's perception becomes most precise and most complete, because they are no longer partially blinded by the desire to see the relationship as it could be rather than as it is. The emotional investment that was filtering their perception, making them extend benefit of the doubt, interpret ambiguous signals charitably, focus on the evidence of good intent, and soft pedal the evidence against it, has been withdrawn. And what remains is the signal, unfiltered. What the empath sees in that state is often definitive, not because they have new information, because they are applying the same information to a different analytical framework. The data was always there. The pattern was always present. What changes is the interpretive lens, from one oriented toward connection to one oriented toward clarity. And clarity, in someone with that level of perceptual access, produces conclusions that are very difficult to revise once they have been reached. This is the mechanism that makes the quiet empath so significant to anyone inside a relationship with them. The empath who goes quiet is not grieving the relationship. They are not confused about what happened. They are not waiting for an explanation or an apology or a demonstration of change. They have already understood. And once they have understood, once the analysis is complete, the pattern is clear, the conclusion has been reached, there is no social performance that can reverse it. This is what people mean when they describe encountering an empath who has gone through this process. There is something in the interaction that feels like facing someone who already knows. Not suspects, knows. And who is simply watching to see if the performance will continue. It always continues, and the empath always knows it for what it is. Now we need to be precise about something. The concept of the empath in popular culture is often disconnected from the psychology research on which it is nominally based. But the specific characteristics being described here, elevated interoceptive awareness, high sensitivity to social and emotional cues, strong activation in the neural systems associated with shared affect and social modeling are documented, measurable, and have been studied in consistent frameworks. The people who exhibit these characteristics at high levels are not a mythological category. And the pattern being described, the recalibration under chronic misalignment, the withdrawal of emotional investment, the persistence of perceptual accuracy after withdrawal, is consistent with what behavioral research on emotional regulation under chronic social stress shows. The danger attributed to these individuals is real, but it is not the danger most people reach for when they hear the word dangerous. There is no aggression here. There is no threat. There is something more precise and in some ways more final. Accurate perception combined with complete emotional disengagement. That combination is rare. And in any relationship where it appears, it changes the structure of everything. Consider what happens in the specific dynamics where this pattern most often emerges. High empathy individuals are disproportionately present in relationships where someone else's social strategy depends on their continued emotional availability. Relationships where one person relies on the empath's persist investment to maintain a pattern that would otherwise be unsustainable. The relationship functions as long as the empath continues to absorb, to interpret charitably, to explain away, and to maintain. When the empath withdraws that function, the pattern loses its infrastructure. The empath is not reacting to a single event. They rarely are. It's just. Behavioral research on this consistently shows that the threshold is crossed through accumulation, the compounding of small events over time, each individually deniable, none individually sufficient to produce a break. What crosses the threshold is not a particular offense. It is the realization that the pattern is stable, that the next event will follow the same structure as the previous one, that the analysis has reached a conclusion the evidence no longer contradicts. Once that threshold is crossed, the behavior change is typically irreversible. Not because the empath makes a decision they then maintain through willpower, because the neural systems involved in the recalibration have genuinely changed their orientation. This is not a choice being sustained. It is an adaptation that has completed itself. An adaptation, unlike decision, cannot be easily reversed by the person on the receiving end. You can change someone's decision by changing information, their emotional state, or their assessment of what the situation costs them. You cannot reverse an adaptation by performing regret or producing an explanation. The adaptation does not respond to those inputs the way a decision does. The system has classified the situation and moved to a different mode of operation. This is what makes the empath's silence so final. It is not a stance they are taking. It is a state they have entered. Most people who encounter this finality will attempt to reverse it through escalation, more emotion, more explanation, more demonstration of feeling. This is the instinctive response to what looks like coldness. But the empath who is recalibrated is not cold. They are accurate. And accuracy, by definition, is not responsive to emotional escalation. The accuracy reads the escalation correctly, understands its function, sees beneath its performance, recognizes it as information about the other person's state rather than evidence that the original analysis was wrong. And then it incorporates that information into the existing conclusion. The harder the attempt to reach the empath through emotional performance, the more data the empath receives. And the more data they receive, the more complete and confirmed the analysis becomes. This is the closed loop that makes the recalibration effectively permanent. The very strategies most people would use to repair a relationship after a perceived emotional withdrawal are in this case the strategies that confirm the empath's understanding of what the relationship actually was. There is no correct move for a person on the other side of this process, not because the empath is unreasonable or unforgiving, because their analysis is accurate, and the attempts to reverse it are themselves data. There is a question here worth sitting with carefully. Is the quiet empath a threat? Are they dangerous in the way that word usually functions, as a marker of someone who intends harm, who is operating strategically against another person's interests? The answer is no. And understanding why the answer is no is important. The empath who recalibrates is not operating against anyone. They are operating for themselves, specifically for their own survival inside an environment that their nervous system has classified as chronically misaligned with their actual perception of reality. The withdrawal is not strategic in the sense of being directed at an outcome for the other person. It is adaptive in the sense of being directed at the empath's own functional stability. But here is where the nature of the danger becomes precise. The empath, through the withdrawal of their invisible maintenance function, does not intend to destabilize anything. The destabilization happens anyway. And it happens because what they were providing was foundational to the structure they were both operating inside. When you remove a foundational element without replacing it, the structure reveals what it was actually resting on. Most relationships do not survive this revelation, not because the empath destroys them, because the revelation is accurate, and the structure, once revealed, cannot be unseen. The person who never raised their voice, who never made a scene, who seemed to everyone around them like the most patient and generous presence in any room, that person's silence does more structural damage to the relationships that depended on them than any explosion could have achieved. Because explosions can be repaired. They create visible damage that can be addressed. The empath's withdrawal creates a different kind of damage, the revelation that the thing being repaired was never actually whole. And that kind of damage has no repair protocol. The people who recognize themselves in this description, the people who have watched someone they cared about go quiet in this specific way, know that there is a particular quality to this silence that is unlike any other form of emotional distance. It is not the silence of someone who is hurt and waiting to be reached. It is not the silence of someone who needs space. It is the silence of someone who has completed a process. There is a finality to it that is perceptible even before anyone has named it, even before the relationship has formally changed. People who have experienced this often describe knowing, before anything was said or decided, that something was already over. What they were perceiving was the absence of the maintenance function, the structure without its support. The empath who went quiet did not leave dramatically. They had already left. The body was still present. The conversation was still happening. The messages were still arriving, shorter now, more careful. But the thing that had been holding the connection in its particular shape, the attention, the invisible continuous labor of being fully present with another person, was gone. And everything that remained was an outline of what had been there. Now there is a final layer to this mechanism, and it concerns not just what the empath withdraws, but what they represented in the first place. The empath, in the early phases of any significant relationship, is typically the most invested person in the room, not the most demanding, not the most expressive, the most invested. They remember what you said 3 conversations ago and what it meant at the time. They track your states across time and notice when you are not yourself. They calibrate their behavior to your actual needs rather than your stated preferences, which requires continuous, sophisticated modeling of who you are beneath what you present. They do not simply give you what you ask for. They give you what they have read you as actually needing. This level of attunement is rare. Most people, even people with good intentions and genuine care, are not operating at this resolution. They are responsive when attention is called to them, but otherwise engaged with their own internal state. The empath is oriented differently. An outward attention that is more sustained and more precise than most people can maintain or fully understand. What this means in practice is that the person being cared for by a high empathy individual is experiencing a quality of attention they are unlikely to find elsewhere. The relationship, because of the empath's investment, often reaches a depth and quality of connection that functions as its own form of dependency. Not a manufactured dependency, not something the empath created deliberately. A natural one, produced by the simple experience of being genuinely seen by someone who does not need you to perform in order to receive their care. When that care is withdrawn, the loss is not equivalent to the loss of an ordinary relationship. It is the loss of a specific quality of attention that the person may have encountered only once and may not encounter again. And there is no replacement for it because the source of that quality of attention was a specific human nervous system, not a role that can be filled by someone else. This is the final layer of the danger. Not only does the empath's withdrawal destabilize the relationship by removing the maintenance function, not only does it reveal the structure by withdrawing the thing that was managing it, but it also removes something that cannot be substituted. And most people do not understand what they had until it is completely gone. The closing movement of the recalibration is the one that is hardest to articulate, most important to understand. When the empath has completed the process, when the analysis is done, the investment is withdrawn, and the maintenance function has stopped, they do not typically become vindictive or aggressive or even visibly changed. They become calm, and the calm is not performed. It is the calm of someone who has stopped fighting the gap between what they were perceiving and what they were being told to perceive. The gap was the source of the chronic stress. The moment the empath stops trying to maintain the fiction, the stress produced by that gap is relieved. They feel, in the period after the recalibration, something that people around them often mistake for indifference. It is not indifference, it is the absence of the specific effort of managing the distance between their own perception and the relationship's official version of reality. They are no longer managing that distance. They are simply seeing clearly, and seeing clearly for someone with that level of perceptual SAS produces a kind of stillness that is difficult to disrupt. Not happiness, not relief in any simple sense. The particular quiet of someone who has stopped pretending they cannot see what they can see. The people who try to re-engage the recalibrated empath often find this stillness more unsettling than anger would have been. Anger implies investment. It means the other person still cares enough about the situation to be inflamed by it. The empath's stillness implies something different. Not caring less, but caring differently. Still perceiving everything. No longer directing that perception toward repair. The quietest empaths are the most dangerous, not as a warning about what they will do. As a description of what accurate perception combined with complete emotional integrity looks like in practice. It looks still. It looks calm. It does not perform its own weight. And anyone inside a situation that depended on the empath not seeing clearly, or on the empath seeing clearly and choosing to manage what they saw, is about to understand the full weight of what that particular form of perception actually contains. The quiet was never absence. It was the sound of someone who had finally stopped pretending. And now you know what it means when the most present person you have ever been close to goes completely still. The question worth sitting with is whether you are recognizing something from the outside of that process or from the inside of it. If this description named something that happened to you, the next video goes into what that process mass produced in the person who went quiet, what they carried forward, changed in them permanently, and what that means for every relationship that came after. If this description named something about your own experience that you have been looking for language for, that video is the one to watch next.